Hi, Matthew. I'm doing okay. I should tell everybody that I'm Robert Wright of Blogging Heads TV, and you're Matthew Lee, the intrepid United Nations correspondent for Inner City Press, and kind of for Blogging Heads TV, at least for the moment.
Yeah, sure. I've just started recording, and I'm glad to be speaking with you, and I'm hoping to do it more often. There's a lot of even it's summertime here in the UN. There's a lot of hot action.
One thing that is happening that is kind of epic. I mean, it only happens rarely that a new nation state gets created. And 2 days from when we're taping this on a Thursday, and on Saturday, South Sudan is going to come into existence.
Yes,
right?
It is. It definitely is. It's the last one I remember was Kosovo, but that's still. I'm not saying that they're not a state, but they're not yet a UN member. Whereas this one, South Sudan is already. Many countries are already ready to welcome it, and I believe that before really mid-July they will be a UN member, and they'll be the 193rd member state.
So before we get into what's happening at the UN with respect to that and what's likely to happen, I guess we should give people some background, including me, because I haven't followed this all that closely, and I gather it's a little complicated. So what's going to happen is there are now going to be two countries, North Sudan and South Sudan. South Sudan is the new country that's being created, that's declaring independence. But there was, and this is a result of long-standing civil strife between them.
Decades.
But before that, there was the famous, kind of more famous strife involving Darfur, but that is somewhat a separate matter because Darfur is in the west, right?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I mean, this conflict between North and South Sudan goes back, decades. So it actually predated the Darfur conflict. This is one that goes back to in the 80s. You had U.S. politicians, flying in. I mean, it really was a very bloody conflict. It really came down to Sudan was an Egyptian but mostly a British colony, and these two parts of the country were never really woven together. So it's that the North is really predominantly Muslim. The ruling party wants to make it really an Islamic state, and the South was viewed as animist and Christian, and actually was. Looking back into the history of it, the Brits were sort of Christianized it at a time that it was viewed as really there wasn't a lot of transportation back and forth. So it's always been sort of separate. There was a line drawn in 1956 when the country became independent. And that's the border they're now going back to after decades of struggle. And the key thing was a 2005 peace agreement called the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, which set forward all these steps, including a referendum in South Sudan whether they wanted to become independent. And this was held last year and won by like 98-2. I mean, it's
right. Everyone in South Sudan wants out of Sudan.
Yeah, and I've been there, covering Security Council trips twice in the last, I guess, maybe year and a half. And I don't, I'm always skeptical when I hear any election that's 98-2, but it doesn't surprise me. I mean, I think there was some idea under the Comprehensive Peace Agreement that North Sudan would try to. This was the phrase: make unity attractive. That they would somehow, although they had fought this brutal war and engaged in ethnic cleansing, that for 5 years they would try to sort of show the South the benefit of being with the North, but it never happened. And definitely the two times I was there, it was 100% clear how people would vote. It was really just a matter of sort of. I think some people are surprised that North Sudan is not. There are, as we'll get into in a second, they're definitely fighting along the border and killing more people.
Right.
But the fact that they're sort of allowing it to take place, that probably this Omar al-Bashir, the leader of North Sudan who's indicted for genocide and war crimes in Darfur, will be going to the ceremony and has said he'll help the new state in any way, sort of with the proviso as long as he can pull off some chunks that are oil producing. I mean, he's,
The quick tangent, so what is going to happen to Darfur at the end of this?
That's the really sad part, is I think that there were people. So basically, this conflict goes back for decades. The Darfur sort of, jumped onto the let's say over the last 10 years, it has jumped onto the West's attention, such that Hollywood actors visited it. It was referred to the International Criminal Court, and Bashir was indicted for war crimes there. I have to say, it doesn't seem to me that things are really much better there than they were.
But is it going to be a part of
North Sudan? 100%. And I think
of North, so it will still be under his control.
It not only will be under his control, I think he's used the West's interest and focus on South Sudan's independence to consolidate control. Like there was always this kind of shadowy and somewhat shady Doha peace process in which the real rebels of Darfur rarely went to it and negotiated with Bashir's government. And so since that was happening, they basically created what I would call, a kind of a fake rebel group called the Liberation and Justice Movement. I say it because, as it turned out, that the leader of the movement was a UN staff member that was recruited by the UN to head the thing up. They've now signed something called the Darfur Peace Agreement in Doha and have said, well, that's it. There'll be no more negotiations. The rebel group should either sign this or face, total attack and annihilation by Bashir. It's unclear that not just the rebel groups, but even the people in the camps, I mean, there's a reason. They also wanted to break away from Sudan, but it doesn't appear that that's going to be taking place.
And in the case of Darfur, it's not a Muslim-Christian split, I gather. They're kind of all Muslims, but some are Arabs, basically. And then in Darfur, they're not Arabs, or what?
Yeah, well, people say that. I have to say, not to conflate, what you see with the eye with the reality. It's described that way. I mean, basically, in both in Khartoum and in Darfur, people are both, visibly African, black. I mean, Bashir is black. They'll say he's an Arab. They speak Arabic. They're Muslims. I think one of the things that took place in Darfur is that the people that have lived there for a long, long time are sedentary. I guess is the wrong. It makes it sound like they're sitting around, but they're actually like live in places, and then you have basically the government used nomadic tribesmen to sort of ride into cities on camels and torch them. Basically, there was a long-standing desire of that area to probably be treated like South Sudan, have a referendum and see if they wanted to break away. I mean, it starts sounding ridiculous that from the Sudanese side, like with Bashir, he once came to the UN and held a press conference and said, the West wants to divide Sudan into 5 pieces, and I'm going to oppose it. And it is true. It's a country that's sort of, exploding. Like it never really was a country. I mean, but the Darfurians, they say, well, if South Sudan gets a referendum, why don't we get one? But I would almost say, in a way, a cynic's view would be, the West used Darfur as almost a bargaining chip to get Bashir to allow South Sudan to succeed.
So the deal is he gets to keep Darfur if he'll let go of South Sudan.
That seems to be the deal.
Implicitly using it.
That really does seem to be the deal. And the reason I say that is that even like people in the Obama administration, I hate to say it, that were very vocal on Darfur, let's say 3 years ago, as things have come closer to this, would Bashir give up South Sudan, a lot of the focus has gone off it. I have to say that. It's almost amazing to see people, like Obama's ambassador to the UN, Susan Rice, say the Darfur rebels should sign on to the Darfur peace agreement. When you look at it, it basically is just ceding the area back. It doesn't really provide rights to people in Darfur. It doesn't provide autonomy. But it's a way to sort of say, well, we got them a peace agreement and we've accomplished our real goal, which is South Sudan.
If you were going to defend this cynical maneuver, I guess one thing you could say is, when I first heard about the vote for independence in South Sudan, the standard view, it seemed to me, was that, this is going to be trouble because they're going to vote for secession. There's no way that he's going to let them go, so we're going to have a civil war between North and South. And it may be, although there is conflict going on in a couple of border spots, it may be that we are going to successfully avert that. Is that right?
No, I think that's true. I mean, exactly. There's different ways to look on it. I mean, there's more than a little bit of conflict. In fact, some people are, there's 73,000 people, by the UN's own count, displaced in South Kordofan. They're literally, as we, in recent days, like yesterday, continued, literally bombing by the government out of Antonov aircrafts of civilians. Because here's the strange part. So it's all a question of like where you draw the border. In this part that's called South Kordofan, there's an area called the Nuba Mountains. These are people that, although they're geographically going to be left in the north, they fought with the Southerners in the Civil War. So the leading party in South Sudan is the SPLM, and it has a northern branch. It's SPLM North in South Kordofan. So basically what Bashir is doing is saying, okay, South, you can go, but this opposition that remains in South Kordofan, I'm going to annihilate it. So the allegations has been really like people going house to house to find SPLM leaders.
The vote for independence came in the absence of a clear understanding of where the borders actually are.
You nailed it. Exactly.
And does the UN have a position on this?
No, this was all supposed to, in a way, on paper, this was all supposed to be done at the same time. There was supposed to be there was also supposed to be elections in Abyei and South Kordofan. Not the same thing of do you want to be independent, but do you want to be with the South or not with the South? But because they could never agree on who could vote in it, it's the same situation as that you have in Darfur, in which you have there's a stable, sedentary population that lives in Abyei and South Kordofan, and then there are these nomadic tribes. And I mean, in fairness to the northern position, these guys are not all just they're not just nomads in order to commit genocide. They're actually like herders. So you do have a legitimate kind of demographic dispute to people that every year since time immemorial travel through this area to get water, etc. for their animals. Do they have some right there? And they probably do have some right there. Do they have as much right as the people that live there year-round? It's unclear, but they would, the reason that some of these people have taken up arms is they say, if this becomes independent and you build a fence, we can't, our livelihood is destroyed. And I think the government in Khartoum uses that probably somewhat legitimate fear of a loss of, livelihood and a way of life to say, hey, take some weapons, why don't you wipe these people out, drive them into the South so that you're the new majority. It's very ugly,
Yeah. So what do you think the prospects are for this actually being resolved peacefully soon? I mean, is there the hope that once independence actually happens on Saturday, that everyone will say, okay, no more fighting, it's official now, or what?
I think that there's enough. I mean, the other reason is so then one question becomes, why didn't Bashir try to block the referendum or try to just invade? And I think the reality is number one, South Sudan, they fought to at least to a standstill. I mean, they have a pretty, it's a very underdeveloped area, frankly. But they fought very strong. They wanted to be independent, and also they have some of the biggest friends in the world. I mean, the U.S. Not just as a matter of sort of like dry foreign policy, but almost like Colin Powell, for example, is going as part of the U.S. delegation to the Independence Day. There's a long-standing bipartisan commitment to South Sudan. So I think if Bashir really were to roll in with tanks on Juba, the capital, he would face big opposition. I mean, I guess someone could say he'd end up like Gaddafi, getting bombed by NATO until he's.
Although I do think we may have a little intervention fatigue among the Western
powers. Maybe he'll do that. I mean, I think a really kind of a worst case scenario is that someone like Bashir sees that and says, hey, I'll call their bluff. But I don't think he would have gone this far down the road. Do you know what I mean? Once they declare independence, it really is it's not a civil war anymore to roll tanks into Juba. It's an active war, right? And I think in a lot of African countries, even that sort of innately side with North Sudan, I'm thinking of Egypt in particular, they've said we're going to recognize South Sudan. There's basically, the diplomatic battle either was lost or wasn't fought on Bashir's behalf. So the Arab League. So I think, but what's going to happen is, and I don't think it's just going to be small border clashes. The fighting in these areas of South Kordofan, Abyei, and there's the Blue Nile State, it's going to get worse because what happens right now, there's a UN peacekeeping force that's on both North and South. Beginning Saturday, they have no more legal right to stay in the North, and Bashir has said you need to get out. So basically, not that the UN has really done it.
What is the problem with getting out? In other words, what particular good are they doing there?
That's
now?
In fact, some people are saying. I mean, the idea, obviously, of a peacekeeping force is somehow its very presence will protect civilians. It's not clear. It certainly hasn't in the last few months in South Kordofan.
Well, in principle, would they protect people in Darfur?
The UN has $1 billion. It's a joint UN-AU peacekeeping force called UNAMID. I mean, they are there in the sense of when the Janjaweed attack a village or an IDP camp, people come to the UN base and seek protection. Often there's criticism of the peacekeepers not doing enough to protect them. Probably, in fairness, are people somewhat, unless you take the view that it's bad because it gives people the illusion that they're being protected and they're not. Probably they're somewhat more protected just because, having, whatever it is, 10,000 peacekeepers there, even if they do nothing. And I'm not, arguably they do.
So what do you think the UN's going to do when in light of his demand that they evacuate
they're going to leave.
the North?
I mean, I've been following. Last night I was here till 8 p.m. Following this resolution that they're trying to pass for the new one. Even the U.S. Nobody is saying that they're going to stay there without the North's consent. The whole gamble here was there was this process in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, in which the North and South were negotiating. It was being mediated by Thabo Mbeki, former president of South Africa. A lot of people say he's on Bashir's side, but they did reach an agreement about Abyei, which had been a lot of fighting. It's another one of the border areas. And about 2 weeks ago, they reached an agreement in Addis to create a new peacekeeping force, but made up of only one country's soldiers, Ethiopia. There were going to be 4,000 Ethiopian troops in Abyei, funded by the UN, but in a way it's a unique. Most UN peacekeeping forces have like 3 or 4 countries, and it's very much under UN control. In this case, the only way that North Sudan would agree to it is having one country that they trusted, Ethiopia, provide all the troops, funded by the UN. But here was the big fight. It has no human rights monitoring component. It's basically just a armed police force or disengagement force. So it was a big gamble in a way for the UN. It was surprising. Some of the countries like the UK and France were fighting to try to have it pretend that it would monitor human rights as well, but North Sudan didn't agree to it. So it's in a way it's fun. By giving away South Sudan, most of the leverage on every other issue has passed to North Sudan's hands. So when they say get out, you've got to get out. When they say no human rights, there are no human rights, etc.
Yeah. So best case scenario come Saturday is that the secession itself happens in a fundamentally peaceful way, and the fighting along the borders somehow subsides, although I guess it's not totally clear to me how it would. I mean, if there's ongoing dispute about where the border is.
Exactly. I think, there's a whole other sort of development side where there's a lot of talk of building up South Sudan as a state. I mean, I think it's starting out really, at sort of, they have a very big road to climb. I mean, 15% of the people have any telephones. Less than 80% have no toilets. There's very few roads. I mean, the 2 times I've gone there, when you fly there, it's basically empty green space. It looks like sort of felt farmland. And then there's one big town, Juba, where there's no street lights. I mean, I don't want to put it down. I think they have a lot of big friends that will now swoop in. And at the first time I went there was not a printing press in the whole city. It's the capital of South Sudan, of a country now. So I mean, maybe that's not necessary anymore. Maybe they'll just jump over. I think but I think the border questions really turn on the sort of unspoken thing here is oil, which is that Sudan is an oil-producing state, but probably 70 or 80% of its oil is produced in the south. So they're going to lose all of that money.
Wow.
That's really been the big dispute here.
Well, then it's amazing enough that this is even happening.
It is amazing, but they, South Sudan had sort of big enough friends, and there's been one of the ideas, and I think it's been a kind of a failure of the diplomacy, and the U.S. has been very involved in this, right? They have the State Department appointed this guy, Princeton Lyman. The U.S. is always saying it's going to work this thing out. Is everyone thought that before that the sweetener for Bashir before allowing independence or accepting the referendum would be some deal on oil. Either they would get to keep some part of the revenue, or South Sudan would commit to keep using pipelines and paying a fee for it. A lot of these areas that are in dispute are in fact oil-producing areas.
Right, and that's what he's trying to secure at the last minute, as is the final concession in a sense, is let me have these disputed lands.
I think exactly. And the larger problem is that people always say Abyei, oil-rich Abyei, really doesn't have that much oil. Most of the oil is in fact just the other side of the line in South Sudan, like Unity State, White Nile. So it does lead one to believe that it wouldn't be beyond beyond expectation if in fact in this dispute about the border, North Sudan started trying to move it south.
Well, is there any prospect that UN troops, although they will leave North Sudan as narrowly defined, will be willing to
engage?
To engage in the disputed territories?
I mean, so what's happened is the two hottest disputed territories right now are Blue Nile and South Kordofan, and they're leaving there. I think the hope of
Wait, you said they are leaving?
Yeah, they have to leave because that's north of the border. There's still some dispute about
Well, if that's north of the border, why is it disputed? If everyone agrees it's north of the border.
One, exactly where the line is disputed, and two, these were territories that under the Comprehensive Peace Agreement were supposed to have sort of a referendum, a vote, a consultative process if they wanted to go with the South. So that's what makes them disputed.
So the UN troops are leaving for sure.
They are leaving those areas.
Well, then they probably will fall into the hands of the North, won't they?
That seems.
So that's probably what's going to happen. Is the disputed areas are going to fall into the North's hands, and that's probably going to be that.
The one wild card here is that the people, for example, in South Kordofan, they have an armed group. This SPLM North is armed. I don't want to, they're not as well armed as the North, but probably, so you're going to end up having these areas being described as sort of areas still subject to civil war. And I think the question is going to be, because there's a large confluence of interest and even sort of like identity. I mean, for example, I think some of the leaders in South Sudan actually come from South Kordofan and Abyei. So they're not going to feel that if they see the North, wildly abusing those areas, it's possible that the South will try to like go up and defend people.
Is it clear how these regions would have voted if they had voted?
It's pretty clear. Unless you,
they would want to be with the South.
Unless you include, at 100% or more, the nomads, those who live there, it seems pretty clear, would go with the South. And the main reason is, I mean, think about it. In a way, that's why it's kind of I don't want to say it's a vicious circle, but the way in which the North outreaches to South Kordofan is by dropping bombs. It's not. It hasn't been a very effective hearts and minds campaign. So every day that goes by makes it more likely, if you had a vote, that people would say we want out. And the other thing is, even people that are in South Kordofan that are Muslims, they don't. I mean, the idea is that Bashir has said we're going to impose Sharia law. Once the South goes, this is a country under Sharia law, which doesn't. People.
All of North Sudan, he's saying, will be under Sharia law.
That's correct.
Yeah.
And it's not like it's. So it's not. I mean, some jokesters will say, it's all about, can you drink beer in Abyei? I think that's a little off mark. But it's true. It's a very stringent, there was a UN staff member, actually, that was, condemned to whipping for wearing pants. It's a pretty extreme form. And I think, the one thing is again, not to let Bashir off the hook, but he is, he's indicted for genocide and war crimes, right? So he's a beyond the pale. But there are people more extreme than him. For example, he kind of agreed initially to a ceasefire and somewhat kind of a peace agreement on South Kordofan, and then people to his Islamist, further out than him, said this is an outrage. Why are we even negotiating with these people? And then he disavowed the agreement. So I mean, some people are thinking either he'll be overthrown, or he's in a.
So he's feeling pressure from the radicals domestically, from people even more to his whatever. So is part of the deal implicitly for him giving up South Sudan that the indictment will just kind of sit there and nothing will happen? I mean, I don't really know what alternatives there are. I mean, the UN isn't known, I guess, for invading countries to seize people who've been indicted. But
that's a good. There's another carrot that the U.S. has been using, which is that to take them off the state sponsors of terrorism list. And they haven't actually given Sudan that yet, but they have been people like John Kerry have traveled there and said, we're going to, if you let South Sudan go, we're going to, disengage. Basically, they've almost said, taking Sudan off this state sponsor of terrorism list will ride on how they treat South Sudan. No longer will it ride on Darfur. That was a terrible message that they sent. They were basically saying, right? And they did say that. The ICC thing is more complicated because it's like, the question is, he's visited a few countries that are members of the ICC, and he hasn't been arrested. He recently visited China, which is not a member of the ICC, but to get there was a big controversy of how he would fly. He went to an anti-terrorism conference in Tehran, and then, he wanted to go on a 3-day state visit to China. So Human Rights Watch mini group said China should arrest him. That's pretty unrealistic, given that China is not a member of the ICC. But to get there, he had to fly over. The most logical way would have been to fly over Afghanistan. But there you really have a question of, would ISAF and NATO, force the plane to land? So there was some last-minute scuttlebutting, and no one's really.
Couldn't he just fly over America? We're not part of the ICC.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, but see, America's under Obama, we voted to, voted to refer Gaddafi to the ICC. I think that the U.S. position is that ICC warrants should be enforced by ICC members.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, as long as they don't involve Americans.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so that's in the referral of Gaddafi, they got a carve out for any peacekeepers and U.S. soldiers. Right. They're in transition, I guess you could say. But I don't think there certainly is no written deal saying if you let South Sudan go. And I mean, in a way, some of the sort of more realpolitik people say this is a problem with the ICC. I mean, it's all fine and good to say there should be no impunity, but the question is, this is why people never give up, right? I mean, I think that you.
Yeah, well, in general, I mean, these institutions of global governance, many of them are relatively toothless. Some of them have been developing some teeth, but yeah, it's a big problem. And of course, but the U.S. can hardly complain if we're not even going to sign on to the thing.
Yeah, absolutely. No, we're in a.
So there's kind of the good news is South Sudan may get its independence in an ultimately kind of peaceful way without a huge civil war, but we'll wait and see what happens along these disputed areas. But anyway, that's the potential good news. Bad news is, at a minimum, the price paid is Darfur, kind of. And North Sudan is going to have continued control of that. Now, is there reason to believe that the violence in Darfur that will return to its previous levels or anything, or is that kind of cooling down?
I think that there is, and I think the reason is that there's this lull now. Bashir is, he's definitely not stupid. So in the same time period where the focus was on South Sudan and people were sort of walking on eggshells, they praised him when he went the day before the referendum. He traveled down to Juba and said, if you vote to be free, I'll support you. And literally, like many leaders previously very critical of him, praised him. At the same time, he basically jammed through this quote Doha process in Doha, Qatar. And basically he said this thing is going to be signed by the middle of July by whoever wants to sign it, and whoever doesn't sign it is an enemy of the state and will be liquidated. So I would not to have a crystal ball, but sometime by this summer you're going to actually see an uptick in violence as he tries to implement that.
Okay.
And he'll still have the playing cards of South Kordofan. He's played this pretty well, so that even the big critics have sort of held their tongue and said, well, right now the focus is on South Sudan,
But on the other hand, he will at least have surrendered the great bulk of South Sudan, so he'll no longer have that as leverage, in a sense.
Yes, that's true.
Because I think you're right. He can't plausibly invade. For one thing, there will probably still be UN troops, but moreover, once a country exists, invading it is such a clear breach of the UN Charter that it should, in theory, be easier to muster concerted international resistance to it than it is to get international intervention in an internal matter such as Libya.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. The whole, this horse, left the barn on this one. And the thing that's sort of amazing here is that they literally have already scheduled. I'll look at the schedule. The Independence Day is July 9th, and on July 13th there's a scheduled Security Council meeting to vote them in as a member of the UN, and that will be followed probably the next day by a General Assembly vote. So I think this I don't know, I haven't looked into other birth of a nation timelines, but to me this looks pretty fast. And once that's taken, it seems highly unlikely that they'll be invaded by North Sudan, at least other than in these border oil producing areas.
Okay. Well, you've given us a very good background to use in following the developments beginning Saturday. Now, speaking of Libya, you wanted to talk about that a little too, right?
Yeah, I did. The one thing is in covering the Security Council, like this, I mentioned last night, like, to tell you the truth, even though at least more so than on other issues, the Security Council members, particularly like the P5, let's say China and the U.S., surprisingly, are kind of rowing in the same way on Sudan. It's almost like the difference was, I think a lot of activists and advocates think, China's sided with Bashir, China's behind all the problems. That's certainly true in the past. China's pretty smart. They now have, good business relationships with Juba as well. When I was there's a hotel called the, Beijing Juba Hotel. The Chinese consulate is there. They're going to be pumping oil one way or another. The real split in the council right now is around Libya, where just a few months ago, in late March, when the council voted, to authorize military action to protect civilians in Libya, it wasn't unanimous. The first vote earlier back, I guess in February, Resolution 1970, all 15 voted to refer Gaddafi to the ICC and to call for an arms embargo. And then when they said, let's actually authorize military force to defend Benghazi, it was 10 votes in favor and 5 abstentions. But Russia and China didn't veto it and went along with India, Brazil, but and Germany, surprisingly. Since then, and the sort of the event that sort of really made this split clear was the decision by in this case France to openly drop weapons to. First, it was said to the rebels. Now,
well, I would say resistance from Russia, or at least complaining by Russia, began earlier when the intervention from the air went beyond, protecting civilian populations in an immediate direct sense and started including bombing Gaddafi's compound. Some people argued that was consistent with the UN resolution because it had said something about using any means necessary to protect civilian populations. But a lot of people thought that at that point, the U.S. and its allies had exceeded the authority actually granted by the UN resolution under which they acted. At that point, Russia started complaining.
Yeah, you're absolutely.
And then you're right. Phase 2 is the arming of the rebels, which France has just owned up to. And some people say, wait a second, the UN had earlier declared an arms embargo on the whole area. And so you can't send arms into the area.
Yeah,
right?
You're absolutely. I didn't mean. I probably said it wrong. I guess what I meant is that there was a lot of sort of like, and maybe I'm also like it's too UN centric. There was a lot of complaints when the bombing started. They definitely tried. They hit like a Gaddafi family house, called it a military facility. But the surprising thing to being here at the UN is that although like Sergei Lavrov and other Russians were complaining, there was no move at the UN to sort of try to seek some condemnation of what NATO was doing. And that's actually happened this week. It began on Tuesday, and there's a meeting later today of the Libya Sanctions Committee, at which Russia, South Africa, and others are saying, directly and asking for kind of a ruling, or at least a discussion of whether France's arming of the rebels violates the arms embargo.
Okay. Now, are they trying to get any kind of resolution to that effect?
They are, except I'll say this from the outset, and I was speaking to one of those two countries this morning, because the sanctions committees have to operate by consensus, there is no chance that they'll get a ruling out of that, right? This is one in which France not only has a veto in the Security Council, but has all 15 Security Council members can block anything. It's a big conflict, because it's like they enact an arms embargo, but it's enforced by a committee on which 15 countries have a veto. So basically, it's an arms embargo against everybody. But the reason that I was thinking, not just thinking that it's interesting, but it's become, because of this increased, disagreement about how the Libya resolution has been implemented. It's really cited more and more openly as the reason or the justification for the Security Council taking no action on Syria. Basically, you have countries saying, you screwed us or misled us or, on the Libya resolution, and therefore we're not going to pass any Syria resolution.
Yeah, of course. Isn't it also true that nobody has an appetite for actual intervention in Syria the way we intervened in Libya, right? Nobody in Western Europe or the United States government, executive branch, feels like bombing Syria, right?
Yeah, I think that's true. But you see, at least in terms of, and I'm not really sure what a resolution on Syria would do. But this is international politics. So you have a lot of pressure, certainly in Europe, but probably in the U.S. too. But more in Europe, saying, why haven't the European countries been able to get the Security Council to condemn Assad, who's every day cracking down and killing people? And so I think it's been this strange standoff where you have the European members, not really joined by the U.S., but France, the U.K., Germany, Portugal. They proposed, long ago, a resolution on Syria and said, we want it passed, we want to vote on this. There was a weekend meeting which Russia and China didn't even go to. They've been trying to. In a way, I hadn't thought of this until now, but because they're unable to do anything now on Libya, right? Once you vote by any means necessary, and you give all 15 countries a veto of anything to change that, you can't stop that. And so basically, I don't even know if they've tried to negotiate and said, we'll give you something on Syria if you stop bombing Libya. But it's basically become, you screwed us on Libya, don't even think about Syria. And so don't even think about it to the extent of like Russia and China not going to a Saturday consultations about the resolution. And it's sort of, the funny thing is that, I talked to both sides. The Western ones are like, it's so, they basically say, why should the people of Syria suffer, because of this sort of spiteful decision by Russia, China, India, South Africa, not to even discuss a resolution. But I think there is another way to look on it, which is that why did France so openly say we're arming the rebels? Even if you think about it, a country that's sophisticated could probably arm the rebels without saying we're arming the rebels, we're airdropping them weapons. To me, it seems like France thought it was popular.
Did somebody figure it out, or did they just?
Yeah, I think it was found out. I think you could say they were confronted by the Figaro, and so they had to admit it. But they've denied things, including in like Ivory Coast and other places that everyone knew they did, but they never admitted it. I think it's probably in some parts of the French populace, and certainly to be a cynic in terms of getting whatever future oil production Libya has once the rebels take over in their It's certainly popular to be seen to have been out in front. So there was almost a competition among European leaders to be the first to recognize Benghazi as the legitimate representatives.
Well, I also think as a political matter, the irresolution of the Libyan situation has become a liability for all governments that support it, certainly including France's, and they'd like it to end as soon as possible.
That's probably true. And I mean, maybe it's almost like if Gaddafi were knocked out by a NATO bomb, later today, would that, get the wheels moving to some kind of non-intervention but condemnation resolution on Syria? It actually might,
Well, but again, I think the Western European nations and America would almost fear, a condemnation of Syria if they felt that could become a slippery slope toward intervention. And it isn't just intervention fatigue. It isn't just that, hey, this Libya thing turned out to go on forever. We don't want to start that again. Syria is in a different situation from Libya. It is an ally of Iran's. It is, you can much more easily imagine the situation spinning out of control regionally if you intervene militarily in Syria than in the case of Libya, which is a country that basically nobody likes except a few African beneficiaries of Gaddafi's past, largesse. So I think it's just, I think it kind of your realpolitik considerations make Syria a really unattractive target for intervention. And, meanwhile, I think Israel's feeling is kind of, they prefer the devil they know, They don't welcome the kind of instability that would follow, in the wake that might follow the deposing of the leader. So
I think you're absolutely right. It's a total. And it's almost amazing actually how few friends Gaddafi had at the end of it, despite having I think it's because he was just such a wild card. He funded people's rebels. His policies were always jumping all over the place. So he ended up having no friends. But I think you're right. But I will say, unless I'm which is totally possible, being naive, I definitely think that the Europeans, and to a lesser degree the U.S./Obama administration here, they want this resolution passed. The resolution as proposed.
Wait, they want which resolution passed?
They want, condemning Assad, calling for a political process. They definitely, there's no request in it for a, by any means necessary enforcement of arms embargoes and,
So who is in favor and who's opposed to that on the Security Council?
Basically there seems to be 5 opponents: Russia, China, South Africa, India, and Brazil. And the attempt that
and it is a toothless resolution that you think the U.S. is genuinely behind.
Yeah.
And it's going to go nowhere.
Yeah, exactly. I think that they may be behind it because they know it won't go anywhere. They've not been putting anywhere near the muscle that, let's say, the UK and France. Alain Juppé, the French foreign minister, came and said this resolution should be passed as soon as possible. They tried to put it into blue, like they might call a vote. There was a lot of maneuvering of trying to.
Why are the French suddenly, so involved in all this stuff? Why do they care?
As a total, the one you could say that Sarkozy is currently not all that popular. So it's become a pretty muscular foreign policy. That's the word they use. I don't know if muscular, but.
Well, that's what you heard about the Libyan intervention, but then 3 weeks later you heard it had turned out to be a very unpopular thing.
Yeah, I know, but even turning back the clock to a slightly less high-profile one, when Sarkozy came in, he said he was ending this idea of France Afrique, of France playing a big role as a former colonial power in Africa, and the reality is in the last 9 months, they became they wouldn't say the kingmaker. They devoted their own military force to enforcing election results in Ivory Coast by blasting the presidential palace of Laurent Gbagbo from helicopter gunships, and they've played a role kind of totally beyond their real sort of punching power in the world in Libya, and they're very loud. It's kind of I see it as either they they're trying to sort of wrap themselves in the veil in this idea that they're vindicating human rights, or it is a kind of a diversion. I don't want to say it's you're right. You're absolutely right. I don't really know how it plays out in the polls at home, but I do know that they've become much more active in all these places.
Could be BHL.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah.
Bernard Henri Lévy and his considerable influence.
Yeah. Exactly. I thought you were going DSK, but we'll leave that.
No. Well, he will defend DSK too. He condemned.
Yeah.
he condemns dictators and defends the. But anyway, any last thing you want to say about that before we talk a little about? You wanted to talk about what the flotilla.
One thing, and this is sort of, we've basically been talking about sort of like, the Europeans, and then on the other side Russia and China. But I mean, the one, just sort of for the record on Gaddafi, the African Union. I mean, a big thing, even though at the UN at least, a big thing is this relationship with the African Union, because like 70% of the items on the Security Council's agenda are in Africa, 80% of the peacekeepers. So it's strange, there's this real, everyone pays lip service to the UN, working with the African Union, until it actually, becomes there's a difference of opinion. And on Libya, there's a difference of opinion. Basically, it's not like the AU is saying, leave Gaddafi alone, but they're very much saying there should be a focus on the political process. We never voted for regime change. They had a meeting in Malabo, Equatorial Guinea, which is hardly a human rights paradise over there, but they met there, and they basically told African states, don't enforce the ICC indictment of Gaddafi. And so the one thing that was, I think it puts the Security Council in this weird spot. In the middle of June, foreign ministers of South Africa and other countries came to the UN and wanted to somehow engage with the Security Council about Libya, sort of start working together. And, basically, like, the UK said, well, why don't we just do this as a closed-door lunch? I mean, I know this because I talked to the African delegations here. They were outraged. There ended up being a meeting, but it was a closed-door meeting. And at the end of that meeting, South Africa proposed it's called a presidential statement. It's not even a resolution, but some document saying that they'd come, saying that, yes, the resolution should be complied with, that there should be a political solution. And I want to say that the U.S., more so than the European countries, totally blocked this presidential statement proposed by South Africa. Like, initially made an amendment that would have said we recognize Benghazi as the official representatives of the Libyan people, which is not even the U.S. position. And it just was really, and it was kind of interesting to see from here that, number one, that the U.S., which is at least sort of like, to the eye, sort of closer with the African Union than, let's say, the UK or France, actually totally rebuffed them. And it also sort of spoke to I think, the kind of, when you really get down to it, the total lack of power of African countries in the Security Council, in the UN. Maybe it should be that way. Maybe these countries, maybe half of them are corrupt, maybe they were paid by Gaddafi, but the whole lip service that was paid to sort of like, let's work with the AU, has been, it's the same rift that's with Russia and China about Libya is even, I think, deeper around this, around Libya with the African Union. And I'm not really sure how, it's almost like at a certain point the South Africans started sort of downplaying that they'd, lost. But they lost. Their foreign minister came here and said, we're going to pass this presidential statement, and they got nothing. They got nowhere. And I think that it goes back to the Syria thing. It's sort of like, if you're going to engage in diplomacy, sometimes you have to give your counterparty something, I mean, like, what would it have cost, not to be sort of go native here, but what would it cost the U.S. to let the African Union pass this statement, Maybe some real human rights purists in the U.S. would say, how could you go with that? But you could explain it as saying, it's an unending kind of poker game here, and sometimes you have to lose a hand to win a hand. You can try to win every hand, but
you're saying the resolution had no real
teeth. It had no teeth
anyway.
At all. Exactly. It was,
let them have their say, endorsing some kind of political solution or whatever.
Right, and then just keep blasting away. It wasn't going to stop the sorties of NATO in the least. But it's like, I'm always sort of surprised by that. And then they're surprised when, countries like India, South Africa, and Brazil end up, not playing well, not just sort of getting on the Western bandwagon.
Right.
But they're getting rebuffed. They're not getting treated. Again, some of it's just a matter of, and I know a lot of people that would say, well, South Africa, their record's not that good either. But again, they're one of the largest countries in Africa. You kind of have to engage with them, and engaging doesn't mean you're not always going to get things the way that you want them, right?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. I know we're not always known for our diplomatic sensitivity in that regard.
And I think the irony, to me, if it was the Bush administration, I wouldn't be surprised. I don't think other people would be. They'd just say, these guys are just like my way or the highway. But I want to say it's pretty much that way with the Obama administration here as well.
And you don't have a particular explanation in this case.
No, I think it's probably because they maybe they think there'll be no repercussions from it, or they can just imagine a New York Post headline saying, U.S. agrees to UN statement backing up Gaddafi, it's a kind of a
being
gotcha.
depicted as a diplomatic
yeah, they don't,
loss
and I think,
America.
Even as someone who writes at least online some gotcha headlines sometimes. I mean, I think sometimes you just have to take that punch and say, here's why we did it. You know.
Okay.
There was the last thing. There was a funny event here where the U.S. mission held a big pre-4th of July barbecue at the Central Park Zoo, and the guest of honor was this. Well, at least the most interesting guest was a former Gaddafi diplomat called Ibrahim Dabashi, who was found, cruising around with cheeseburgers and Susan rice and saying that Gaddafi will be gone by the middle of July. So.
Well, he better hurry.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so you wanted to talk a little about the flotilla. Now, this is about. There's a flotilla planned, to break the blockade of Gaza. But you wanted to talk about the last flotilla, which was, I forget when, a year ago or something?
Actually, I think it was more than a year ago. It was more than a year ago. But a year ago, an investigation of it began.
And famously, of course, a number of people were killed by the IDF. A number of people who were on board. Yep. And there was a big argument over who initiated the hostilities. It is safe to say that the IDF forces who landed on the ship were not greeted warmly.
Yeah, there was some rebar. There's definitely, the film shows some rebar swung at them, but also they then opened fire and 8 were killed, all of whom were Turkish. That's sort of a big, and one was a joint U.S. citizen. So basically, the strange thing is, I remember actually being here that there was a Security Council meeting that went to like 2 in the morning, and they came out with a statement saying, there'll be an investigation. There'll be an independent investigation of this, and then we'll figure out what to do. And so, the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon appointed, panel members. A guy called Palmer from New Zealand, Colombian ex-president Uribe, who's viewed as very much on the U.S. and Israel side. And the idea is that they would somehow. It was sort of a way of just kicking the can down the road, saying, there's an investigation going on, so we can't talk about it. The problem is that the chickens have come home to roost, and in a way, it's almost like this panel, rather than just releasing its report, I guess probably within the panel they can't agree on, was what Israel did legal? That's sort of the main question here. And should they pay compensation, etc. But basically the panel has tried to get Turkey and Israel to come to some meeting of the minds, If they could agree on some statement about the flotilla, everything would just go away. But they can't agree, And the Turkish foreign minister has recently said, they're not going to accept any UN report that doesn't follow what the Human Rights Council said, that this was illegal, that they believe that compensation has to be paid, and basically they sort of implied if the UN
that the interception of the ship was illegal.
To them, that's a key point, and they'd almost sort of threatened to begin their own domestic legal proceedings on it. I mean, I guess and you can sort of, from their perspective, you can see it. If it's a hot button political issue in your country, and 8 of your nationals are killed by another government, there's going to be pressure on you. So I would say even Turkey wants to be perceived as this, bridge country and a big diplomatic player. They would like this to go away, but it has to go away in a way they can live with. Then again, the problem is it has to go away in a way that Israel can live with. And since they've said they'll do, I think, the same thing if another flotilla comes, they're not going to abide by a ruling that says that it was illegal what they did. So
there is this UN report that is definitely going to be released.
Here's the thing: the deadline for it to be released was today. So this is I think why I wanted to.
And we know, first of all, we know what it's going to say. It's going to say that the IDF was justified in intercepting the ship.
What we know is this: is that earlier today a UN special rapporteur on the right to food called Olivier de Schutter. He's a pretty sharp guy. I mean, very much to he's to the left, but hyper, extremely well versed. He put out a statement this morning saying he'd been provided with a draft of the flotilla report. And he condemns it. That the flotilla report, he said, that will be released tomorrow, Friday, absolves Israel and says that what they did was legal. And he thinks it's wrong because Gazans have a right to food. I guess his interest in this would be that he's the right to food guy, right? So he's condemned the blockade of Gaza. So he put this thing out, and it makes it it's a pretty interesting news story for the UN, where you have a UN special rapporteur criticizing in advance a report, and in a way criticizing Ban Ki-moon for releasing it. What happened today is that then somehow they got this guy to retract his statement and even say that he'd been misquoted. They said the quotes from him were erroneous. But I have it in my inbox. He sent down an email. It wasn't that we're reading his quotes, by AFP or Reuters or something. The guy put out a very well-reasoned statement. He clearly chose to take a shot across the bow. And then pressure was. I don't know why. I don't even know why he gave into the pressure, because probably he wouldn't be reappointed anyway. But so, anyway, it's made it clear that the report is finished, but now, does this hullabaloo make it that they don't release it tomorrow? Can they just keep kicking the can down the road? Mm-hmm. Eventually, it's going to kind of, and it's all kind of come together because you have these boats. They tried to set sail from Greece, but Greece, the government very much discouraged it, but eventually there's going to be some other boats approaching Gaza.
Yeah, although they're running into a lot of trouble. People are like cutting off their propellers.
Yeah, no, it is. It's quite a. It's
like, yeah. On the finding, the apparent finding that the IDF was justified. I had heard that under international law, once you've got a blockade, you are allowed to defend the blockade fairly assertively. I'm not sure what the law is on. I mean, I think, as I understood it, that just kind of assumes you've got a blockade. Right. I'm not sure what the international law is on what are and are not valid grounds for a blockade.
Right. And I think, I know that the UN, at least, I don't know if it's legally or just politically, but even Ban Ki-moon, who's viewed as he's also called, for there to be no second flotilla, etc. But he's called for an end of the block of the blockade of Gaza. So has Tony Blair. There seems to be even political figures who are pretty sympathetic to Israel have said that the blockade is
well, my understanding is that actually, the blockade per se has been loosened somewhat as a result of the first flotilla. There's more stuff that can come in than before. But my understanding is, you may know better than I, that it continues to be the case that Gaza is not allowed to export stuff. Yeah, and in a certain sense, if that's true, it's more ultimately crippling, right? You just can't develop a serious economy. If you can't export stuff, right? Yeah. And what is the security risk to Israel of Gaza exporting stuff?
No, it's a very good. You're absolutely right. I remember, but there used to be flour production. Of flours, not bread making flour.
Yeah, FLOW.
Yeah. And it's true. I guess so that's. I think that's probably why DeShooter spoke out, because he's not speaking out necessarily about. The idea of was it legal to shoot? It's not really. It's almost a criminal issue. But the question is, if the blockade itself is illegal, then obviously enforcing it,
right. I think if you accept the blockade, what Israel did is considered legitimate, basically.
So no, it's a big. The other, and this is totally jumping. I just remember now with Osama bin Laden dead, there will probably be a lot less focus on those whole North Waziristan and stuff in Pakistan. But the reality is during the last couple of years where they've sort of cracked down, tried to sort of cordon off the area and keep the radicals inside. Basically, it's been impossible to export anything from there. So I met these guys who are
wait, from
where?
From
the Waziristans. They grow apples there, believe it or not. It's thought of. They don't just grow radicals. These guys have orchards, and they basically can't. Fruit dies on the vine.
Because there's a formal prohibition on export, or just because...
Because any trucks going in and out of there are subject to so many searches and such restrictions by Pakistan. Pretty much I don't want to say it's at U.S. request, but probably for their own reasons.
So that's an internal matter.
But I just thought of it in the sense of it's this sort of, at the bottom of it all, you have this, maybe radical Islamist or not, or, apple grower who's getting screwed. And the question is, you're only making more radicals if people can't export
in
their
those
produce.
cases, that may be the effect, yes. Okay, well, listen, this has been a great whirlwind tour.
Right.
And I know you're running off to something in what happened.
Yeah, the Libya Sanctions Committee, which probably to no effect. Russia and South Africa will denounce France's weapons drop to the rebels. Should be interesting.
Okay, so we should. I thank you. We should remind people to read either innercitypress.com or innercitypress.org, which are two
they can go either way. The
different aspects of your media empire.
It's just the .com is mostly UN, and the .org covers also banking, Community Reinvestment Act, stuff like that.
Right. And you got a Twitter feed too.
That's right. Yeah, just Inner City Press at Twitter. Now it works pretty well for the UN because you end up with a lot of little kind of scraps of when in covering these meetings, a lot of things happen in the back and forth that don't necessarily make it into a story at the end of the meeting. So it's fun.
Yeah, I encourage everyone to follow you.
Right.
Okay. Well, thank you, Matthew. Let's do this again before long.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
See you around.